This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Sometimes, though, I like to look at the other end of the spectrum, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst cards that cost 10 or more mana. 10 mana is a lot, and if you're spending that much, you should probably be doing something that either wins you the game or drastically shifts a game in your favor. However, not all cards that cost a ton of mana actually get there. Although I will say, of the worst lists I've done on mana value, this list has the least bad cards on it on the whole, and for the most part, spending 10 mana does tend to give you at least some value. As is usually the case for my worst lists, the cards that appear on this list, and the order in which they appear is left up to my opinion, but there are some criteria for a card to be considered at all. In particular, the card has to be bad in all three of Magic's main play modes, that is 40 card formats, 60 card formats, and 99 card formats. It also has to have been bad for all of its history. It's challenging to call a card one of the worst cards in the game if all of those things aren't true. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the worst 10 plus mana cards in Magic. At number 10, it's Rust Goliath. For 10 generic mana, you get a 10/10 with Reach and Trample. While that creature is certainly big, it's also eminently easy to remove and simply not impactful enough for such a mana investment. What saves the Goliath from a higher spot on this list is Prototype, which means you can cast it for an alternate cost to get a smaller creature. In this case, you can spend 3 generic and 2 green for a 3/5 with Reach and Trample. That mode doesn't exactly give you an impressive creature either, but unlike the other creatures on this list, it does mean this can do something before you get to its insanely high mana cost. At number 9, it's Soul Scour. This probably has the most upside of any card on the list, but that tells you just how bad the cards on this list are. For 7 generic and 3 white, this is a sorcery that destroys all non-artifact permanents. That's powerful because it does a great job of blowing up most of the board, but that's what you should expect at a minimum for this much mana. But this also comes with a very serious problem. The fact it doesn't hit artifacts is no small thing, especially in Commander, where there tend to be tons of them all over the board. Furthermore, it's in white, a color that isn't usually great with artifacts, so there's a good chance that casting Soul Scour hurts you more than it hurts any of your opponents. It's far too inconsistent of a card for this much mana. Sweepers tend to be some of the most heavily played cards in all of Commander, and yet Soul Scour appears in 0.006% of all the white decks in EDHREC, and that's probably about right. At number 8, I have Blinkmoth Fusion. Like Soul Scour, this card has some serious potential. After all, it untaps all of your artifacts, and it has affinity for artifacts, one of the most powerful abilities of all time. That means it costs 1 less generic mana for each artifact you control. So, what's the problem? Well, the fact that the base cost is 14 mana. It's funny, they made a ton of cards in Mirrodin block with affinity way too cheap, but on this one, they turned the knob way too far in the other direction. Even with affinity, that mana cost is incredibly prohibitive, and you also need to have a board with the right composition for untapping your artifacts to matter in the first place. If you really want this kind of effect, you can just use cards like Dramatic Reversal or Turnabout, both of which have no setup cost to speak of and can do the same thing for you. At number 7, I've got Dead Drop, which is pretty similar to Blinkmoth Fusion. Delve is a famously overpowered mechanic that allows you to exile cards from your graveyard to pay for the generic mana in a card's cost. If you can quickly load your graveyard, you can play some pretty powerful spells with Delve, but they made Dead Drop too expensive for it to be worth it. For 9 generic and a black, it makes target players sacrifice 2 creatures. The problem here is that this not only has a high mana cost, but it's also an effect that isn't always good. Something like Treasure Cruise is almost as expensive, but drawing 3 cards for 1 mana is always great. A Double Edict effect isn't. There are frequently situations where it's useless because your opponent doesn't care about creatures anyway, or they have so many creatures by the time you finally cast it that it's irrelevant. At number 6, it's Aname as 1. For 8 generic, 2 black, and 2 green, you get an 8/8, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, you get to tutor up a spirit and put it into play, and when it dies, you can exile Aname as 1 to return a spirit from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Aname does do a whole bunch of stuff, potentially giving you a 3-for-1, but there is a pretty big problem here. The only way to actually get the enter the battlefield ability is if you cast it from your hand. This means this huge creature is useless with reanimation strategies, and most ways to cheat it into play, and importantly, casting it from the command zone also doesn't give you the trigger. I have a feeling that the owners of the 191 decks on EDHREC that use Aname as their commander haven't realized you don't get the enter the battlefield ability. So yeah, it ends up being an 8/8 that can reanimate something when it dies in most cases, and that's just not what you're looking for when you spend 12 mana. It's a real bummer they made sure you had to cast it from your hand. While you could do something powerful like search up Junji, I think if you're going through the trouble of getting this into play ahead of schedule, you deserve the payoff. I mean, Atraxa gets to have her completely insane enter the battlefield ability no matter what, and Aname doesn't. That just doesn't seem fair. At number 5, I've got Eternal Dominion. For 8 generic and 2 blue, this sorcery lets you search your opponent's library for an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land and put it into play under your control. Obviously, that's almost never going to be worth 10 mana, but I have good news. Well, and some bad news. Eternal Dominion has Epic, so that means you get a copy of that spell at the beginning of your upkeep each turn, so you're going to snag something from an opponent's deck every single turn. Now, that is worth 10 mana. Only problem is that Epic also means you can't cast any other spells for the rest of the game. Sure, you can get one of your opponent's best cards every turn, but your opponents have the ability to cast multiple spells in a turn, and drawing extra cards and stuff like that actually matters for them. Meanwhile, you just get one permanent a turn. Even if they're powerful permanents, it isn't going to be much of a challenge for your opponent to keep you contained by the stage of the game when you have finally cast Dominion, since they will have tons of mana and cards at their disposal, and you just have this. At number 4, it's Straton. For 10 generic mana, you get a 5/5 Trampler. If things ended there, this might be even higher on the list. But luckily, there is some upside in the text box. It has Domain, which means you get a bonus for each basic land type among lands you control. In this case, Straton costs 1 less for each of them. The absolute ceiling on Straton is a 5 mana 5/5 Trampler, a passable card, but that's only when you jump through some considerable hoops, and even paying 6 for this feels miserable, and anything more than that is absolutely awful. At number 3, I have Gleemax. Yeah, I know, it's a silver bordered card, but this thing seriously bothers me. For 1 million mana, it's an artifact that lets you choose the targets for all spells and abilities. So you're only getting 1 million mana with some sort of combo, and that means it's pretty darn hard to do. That being the case, silver bordered or not, this needs to do something insanely powerful. And yeah, choosing targets for all spells and abilities is strong, but this doesn't do anything to stop creatures, and that's a pretty big problem. This thing is silver bordered. They didn't need to worry about making sure it was balanced, so give people their mana's worth. It should let you choose attackers and blockers too. Heck, it should just give you control of all players' turns. Instead, there's a very real chance you die after going through all that effort to cast it, and there should be no chance of that happening. Still, as bad as Gleemax is, there are 2 10+ mana cards that are markedly worse than it and everything else on the list, including the number 2 card, which is Polar Kraken. For 8 generic and 3 blue, you get an 11/11 Trampler that enters the battlefield tapped. If things ended there, it would probably still be on the list. That's just nowhere near the return on the investment you're looking for, and the downsides don't end there. It also has cumulative upkeep that requires you to sacrifice a land. This means at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter on the Kraken, and then pay the cost for however many age counters it has. So you give up 1 land that first upkeep, then 2, then 3. So this Kraken is pretty disappointing for the work you had to do to put it into play, and if that weren't bad enough, it also starts devouring your lands. And at number 1, it's Aladdin's Lamp. For 10 generic mana, you get an artifact with an activated ability. So let's stop there for a moment. You dump that 10 mana into a card, and you don't get anything at all. Surely the ability it has must be cheap and or incredibly powerful to make up for that, right? Wrong. You could pay X mana and tap it, and then the next time you would draw a card in your turn, you look at the top X cards of your library, put all but one of them on the bottom of your library in a random order, and then draw a card. You might be thinking that the lamp doesn't say it has to tap for the ability, but that's because when it was printed, it was something called a mono artifact, which you can see on the type line. That meant you could only use the ability once a turn, so it wasn't necessary to include tapping in the text box. You might also have noticed that Aladdin's Lamp actually has 5 twice as its casting cost on the original printing. That's right, they didn't have a 10 generic mana symbol at the time, so they did that instead. Arabian Nights was Magic's first expansion, so it isn't too surprising that the card looks so weird to us today. It also means that they didn't really know what they were doing when they designed a 10 mana card, because yeah, this card is awful. Keep in mind that the lamp doesn't actually net you a card, it just consumes an instance where you would have drawn a card anyway. Sure, if you have a zillion mana, you can use it to draw whatever card you want from your deck, which is cool and all, but just play a tutor or something. Not a card that requires a huge investment up front, doesn't draw you cards, and takes a mountain of mana to even be effective at accomplishing anything. This isn't just the worst 10 mana card ever printed, it's one of the worst Magic cards ever printed. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst 10+ mana cards in Magic. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it to help increase its reach. If you want to own any of these awful cards, because maybe you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the over 720 other MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.